By the way, I like this. This is from 中国教育新闻. This is from a website on the right here, which Chinese educators, teachers will go to download materials and read. And I find it really interesting because if you know Chinese, in the middle there is 综合国力, comprehensive national power. And what this is saying is that cultural soft power has become a major component of comprehensive national power. And so it's communicating to teachers throughout China, we want to increase Chinese cultural soft power as a component of our overall comprehensive national power, which includes military and economic power. And I think this exemplifies this worldview I'm talking about. That the world is in a cultural competition, and China has to increase its cultural power in order to, if you're a defensive realist, kind of survive and not be overwhelmed by the West. And if you're an offensive realist, in order to prevail in other realms. Let me give you some examples. First, and this won't take too long. First, of offensive realism. So a book by Li Zhi, a philosopher teaching international relations at the Communication University of China, where journalists and others would study. The book is called Cultural Diplomacy, a Media Studies Interpretation, published by the prestigious Peking University Press. So Li makes a number of refreshingly direct statements. He writes that states try to project their culture abroad in competition with other states in order to, quote, change other states, to infect, affect, and influence foreign people's beliefs and value preferences, to alter the target state's attitudes, decisions, and policies until finally they will benefit our own state's national interests. Sometimes this requires, and this is me now, stretching the truth. He writes, quote, in order to maximize the effect, a state might conceal some unfavorable facts or even provide false information, which aims at enticing other states to focus, understand, and remember the points we are promoting while ignoring others. And that clearly feels like a very realist sort of, even offensive realist take on international cultural relations. Here's a second example of offensive realism. This is from a 2008 article in a journal entitled China's Geocultural Strategy, written by two Shanghai IR specialists, Pan Zhongqi of Fudan University, Huang Renwei of Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, published in Contemporary International Relations. They began by developing the concept of geocultural strategy as analogous to geopolitical strategy, and thereby connoting tough realist competitions among states, but now in the realm of soft power. They're quite optimistic that in these competitions China can prevail, and the key reason is that they find that China has already begun to manifest the beginnings of a cultural renaissance. So China, this is a quotation, successfully established an excellent international image as a responsible, constructive, and predictable country, and has also given the world a new development model, kind of the Beijing consensus, and new value perspectives. So these successes lead Pan and Huang to propose that in the great geocultural competitions of the future, China should work confidently to expand its cultural influence abroad, particularly in what they identify as the, quote, culturally weak zones of Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia. So they write, on the one hand, that these areas, quote, urgently need to strengthen their own culture's special characteristics. And on the other hand, they must borrow from and make use of non-American cultural power in order to resist U.S. hegemony. And they say Chinese culture's great capacity and relative acceptability can provide the key basis and guarantee for the expansion of Chinese culture's latent space in these regions. They go, and so those are actually also in material terms weak areas, and they find in Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, they're also culturally weak, that these societies must do what they can to avoid domination by American culture, and they'll need to borrow from China to do it. So it's an opportunity for China to expand its cultural influence. And they even go on, it might be possible to do this closer to home in Asia because of the influence of, quote, traditional Chinese Confucian culture, which has undergone a renaissance recently. So they suggest that the Japanese cultural zone, Hindu cultural zone, and Islamic cultural zones are all also potential spaces into which China might expand its cultural influence, because they're also trying to resist total Western domination, and they have been influenced, especially Japan and other parts of Southeast Asia, and Korea, Vietnam, by Confucianism. So that was offensive realism. There's a whole lot of this. Let me give you then quickly a couple of examples of defensive realism in a Chinese context. It's very different, actually, because they worry that China is on the ropes. First, in 2006, China Political Thought Work Research Committee joined with the Communist Party's Central Propaganda Department Political Thought Work Research Institute to produce a volume on China's national spirit. National spirit. And from the start, the book suggests the spirit is under threat, and the party has an urgent responsibility to try to defend the national spirit from foreign threats, to provide cultural security. And the authors, the editors actually, in the introductory chapter, identify 4 key components of the threat out there in international relations to the Chinese national spirit. First is, and I kind of like some of the wording here, first, the Davos crowd of global business elites carrying their cell phones and talking about tricks of the business trade in English. So some people don't like that kind of crowd and worry about it. Secondly, the professorial club of transnational intellectual elites who, quote, start from Western conceptual predispositions and go around discussing such topics as feminism and environmental protection. It's pretty scary stuff, right? Then at McDonald's culture, which hooks young people in particular not only on fast food, but also on Western clothing, popular music, and holidays, with Valentine's Day considered especially pernicious. And then the new religious culture, especially new Christian religions, which have attracted a lot of people, not only in China, but throughout other regions. So these people are really worried. They really see a corrosion of Chinese culture. And they know about the rise of China and its economic power and so, but they feel like, well, the internet and Jasmine revolutions and all this stuff, we're really on the ropes here. We're really threatened by this foreign culture. It's all around us. Christians appearing, all these kind of groups appearing. We are not optimistic about the future of China culturally in this environment. And then finally, as an example of defensive realism, 2 People's Liberation Army researchers published an article in 2007 entitled 9 Great Challenges Our Country's Cultural Security Currently Faces. I'm not going to give you all 9. Don't worry about that. Let me just give you 2. First, the poisoning of Chinese culture, said to be pursued intentionally by the West. So, at least to these researchers, the West is intentionally trying to poison Chinese culture. The authors quote, actually without citation, a purported CIA document, CIA, Central Intelligence Agency of the U.S. document, that proclaims a strategy of, quote, doing our utmost to use materialism to entice and spoil China's youth, encourage them to belittle, denigrate, and more openly oppose the ideology and education they originally received, especially communist doctrines, cultivate their interest in pornography, and provide them with the opportunities to consume it. Further encourage them to engage in licentious sexual behavior, make them no longer consider superficiality and vanity to be shameful, certainly destroy the spirit they formerly emphasized of perseverance in the face of adversity. Okay, so, I mean, this is really heartfelt, at least it appears on the page, as they really worry about this. They really see kind of pernicious developments in Chinese society and think it's because China it has to exist and grow in a world that's dominated by Western culture. And they imagine that then there may be some Western agents who are intentionally trying to undermine Chinese culture in this realm. That's a defensive approach. And then finally, actually the second challenge was splitism. Splitism on the part of Taiwanese, Tibetans, and Uyghurs, which they write is clearly encouraged by the West. And so that leads me to a final example specifically on Taiwan. This is from a PLA scholar named Han Zhang in a 2007 book entitled Globalization and a Harmonious World. And I think this is a really important quotation I'm about to read you because it goes to the crux of the neoliberal optimism about cross-strait relations, even U.S.-China relations. And it suggests how the Chinese state should try to manage increasing integration across the Taiwan Strait in order to attain ultimate party objectives in Taiwan. And I'll point specifically those out to you. Here's the quotation. No one can sever the flesh and bone family feeling linking the blood relations across the strait, nor destroy the national sentiments formed by 5,000 years of Chinese civilization. The Chinese mainland's daily becoming strong and great is the decisive force determining that the two sides of the strait are necessarily moving toward unification. Necessarily, without any negotiation to be considered. Continuing. The two sides moving from a long period of separation toward unification is an irresistible, unavoidable trend. The attraction of both sides win in cross-strait economic relations creates the material conditions for the two sides merging together into one. That's Shuangying, both sides win. That's the essence of neoliberalism, that if both sides win, each side will make concessions, each side will accept the other, and you'll have actually a harmonious world develop. Here this author is saying what we'll use both sides win to pursue is to create the material conditions for the two sides merging into one. Okay, so that's a very different take on this interdependence, this kind of phenomenon, than what neoliberals would imagine. Continuing, at present, owing to the differences in their cultural development paths, the Chinese mainland and the Taiwan region have become to a certain extent distinct, acknowledging that fact. However, in line with the development of cross-strait exchanges, these distinctions not only cannot block cross-strait flows, but on the contrary, they are causing the people on both sides of the strait to realize that both sides are working for overall Chinese culture to flourish, right? And then last, second to last, the two sides of the strait form a common body with a single life. The binding of the cultural umbilical cord is eternal. Political integration across the strait will be the necessary end result of the two sides developing relations. Political unification will in the end become the Taiwan people's autonomous choice, because only in this way can they fundamentally avoid the dispute over whether to unify or be independent. To avoid the dispute by accepting it's inevitable that eventually political unification will occur. It's inevitable. The choice facing Taiwan compatriots is clear. Either A, and remember this is 2007, so this is when Chen Shui-bian was still in power, before Ma Ying-jeou. Either A, rein your horse in at the precipice, cease Taiwan independent separationist activities, acknowledge that both sides of the strait belong to one China. It doesn't say that both sides of the strait belong to the PRC, though. Both sides belong to one China. And work to promote the development of cross-strait relations. That's choice A. Choice B, continue single-mindedly on your lonely course, insanely plot to separate Taiwan from China, and in the end, play with fire and get yourself burned. So that's the reality. And Ma Ying-jeou, as a strategist elected in a democratic polity, has to face the fact that the voters, over 80%, want to continue the status quo, whereas across the strait, the state, at least judging from the writings of various people and military deployments and so on, intends ultimately, we don't know when exactly, ultimately to unify Taiwan with the PRC in some sort of single nationality. I'll close with an anecdote. To show you how serious your challenges will be in thinking of ways to achieve peace in which all sides' interests and desires can be respected. This was back in the fall. We had a delegation from a Chinese think tank directly under the foreign ministry visit my university. And we had a private lunch with maybe 4 or 5 USC people, 4 or 5 people from the Chinese delegation present. And I don't know how we got to talking about the naivete of Americans. I don't know how a topic like that would come up. I may have raised it. I don't know. Because I acknowledged that Americans are often naive. Politically, they don't, that kind of thing. And then I said to the leader, I said, here's the most naive thing about Americans. They think, a lot of Americans think at least, that if only Ma Ying-jeou will deepen integration across the strait, soften the rhetoric so he turns back the designification movement and so on, that China will eventually accept Taiwan as at least a de facto independent entity. In other words, this is Ma Ying-jeou's own program. We'll have a peace treaty in which both sides respect the status quo. I said, a lot of Americans actually believe that. And he laughed and he said, How can you believe it when we've said over and over again that eventually the end goal is going to be unification? He said this not in a big place like this, but in a private room at lunch. And I said, will it happen in the 2020s? Because I've read PRC writers say that this should happen sometime in the decade of the 2020s. And he said it could happen in the 2020s or even earlier. He said this. I'm telling you, I swear, he said all these things. So, of course, it was a private lunch. He's not a policymaker, although he's an advisor, at least to the foreign ministry. So, if that's the case, if that's really the objectives of Beijing, those are the objectives of Beijing, then we're headed for, I think, in Taiwan, a kind of crisis insofar as probably after the next election, let's say Ma Ying-jeou is reelected. I have no idea. I think the polls show really close. If he's reelected, he's probably going to say, now it's time to talk about a peace treaty, the kind of things you'll be talking about, right? But he's likely to find that China is not interested in a peace treaty. China wants to have political negotiations with Ma to come to some sort of arrangement, maybe like Hong Kong, for Taiwan to affiliate it with the PRC like Hong Kong. So then I think in the second half of this decade, the issue will really come to a head. And we'll really have to see what the bottom line is for both sides and whether there's some mutually acceptable position, free of coercion, that can be worked out. I'll stop here because I've gone on a long time, and I'm very much interested in hearing your comments and thoughts and observations. Thank you very much. I'll put a mouth on. Thank you.
Walk around with the mic, please. Yes. In 2030, what is the possibility of a Commonwealth state of Taiwan, Singapore, Macau, and Hong Kong?
Well, I don't think any such arrangement would include Singapore. That's never been an objective of the Chinese Communist Party. The problem with a kind of Commonwealth like that, there's a lot of problems with it. First of all, in a 1993 white paper, the CCP suggested that there is only one China, and both sides, Taiwan and the PRC, are part of this China, but that China has a center in Beijing. The capital of that one China is in Beijing. So it sounded like they weren't interested, at least in 1993, in that sort of a Commonwealth arrangement. And so, it's 20 years from now. People don't really I've never come across anyone suggesting that as an outcome. People who write about Taiwan issues in China have to be very careful. It's a very sensitive issue. That, I suspect, at least now, would be outside the latitude of acceptability of people in the security sector in China. People in the People's Liberation Army, people who think hard about Taiwan. That's not right now a part of one of the possibilities. That doesn't mean it might not emerge as a possibility later, but right now I don't see that happening.
Your thesis posits that there are two positions, neoliberalism and Your thesis posits that there are two positions, neoliberalism and neorealism. And from your presentation, it appears to me that they're sort of mutually exclusive. They have to be one or the other. And you mentioned examples of the professor from Harvard who thought one position and then he changed his mind and went to the other position. But my question is not an amalgam of both positions also legitimate? Because I can see on the one hand, China adhering to neorealism. I mean, they truly would like to see their position and power enhanced relative to other countries. And this is why they put such effort during the Olympic Games to try to gain more gold medals than anybody else. And yet, on the other hand, I see that they also endorse the position of neoliberalism, and I see this in many ways. The latest example in the United Nations and the Security Council, when they are so insistent on other countries not interfering in the internal affairs of their country, and yet during that critical vote on the Libyan no-fly zone, they abstained, when I would think that they would have exercised a veto. So my question is, kind of a long way around, is not an amalgam of both positions also legitimate?